Welcome to the conservative intellectual tradition in America. I'm Mallory Factor. I'm a professor here at the Citadel, and I will be your host through this journey of the conservative intellectual tradition in America. Our speaker today is going to be talking about the role of anti-communism within 20th century conservatism, its origins, and the development of neoconservatism. And he's going to contrast neoconservative thought with traditional conservatism and libertarian thought. Douglas J. Feith served as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy from July 2001 until August 2005. In that position, he helped devise the U.S. government strategy for the war on terror. And he contributed to the policy for Afghanistan and for the Afghanistan and Iraq campaigns. Mr. Feith's duties included managing the Defense Department's international relations and representing the department in interagency policy making. War and Decision, Inside the Pentagon at the Dawn of the War on Terrorism, his best-selling book about his work in the Pentagon and the War on Terror, is an absolute must-read for all of you. I strongly urge you to get a copy as soon as you can and to read through it. Also, when you do buy the book, 100% of the royalties that he receives go to veterans. Mr. Feith helped develop the plan for worldwide changes in the U.S. defense posture. He developed new U.S. strategic partnerships with India and Pakistan. He promoted NATO enlargement, its reform, and crafted U.S. policy toward China. Mr. Feith advised President Bush on a range of national security issues, including the nuclear programs of North Korea and Iran, the counterinsurgency in Colombia, and the Palestinian-Israeli peace diplomacy. In the Reagan administration, Mr. Feith worked at the White House. He advised Ronald Reagan as a specialist in the Middle East, where he worked for the National Security Council, and then later as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defense for negotiations policy. Mr. Feith received the Distinguished Public Service Medal twice. That's the Defense Department's highest civilian award. Mr. Feith is director currently of the National Security Strategies at the Hudson Institute. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce Douglas J. Feith.
Thank you. Thank you all. I'm very grateful to the Citadel and to Professor Mallory Factor for giving me this opportunity to talk with you. Some years ago, a candidate for mayor of New York City visited a senior citizens center in the Bronx and spoke about what he said was the issue, crime. He roused his audience by telling it, "A judge I know was recently mugged. And do you know what he did? He called a press conference and said to the reporters, 'This mugging of me will in no way affect my decisions in matters of this kind.'" An elderly woman then stood up and with a heavy European accent shouted, "Then mug him again." Now, in a lecture on neoconservatism, which is going to be the focus of my talk, the story is apt because it brings to mind a famous quip by Irving Kristol in which he defined a neoconservative as a liberal who was mugged by reality. Let's start our examination of neoconservative thought by considering its origins. The two men commonly recognized as the godfathers of neoconservatism were Irving Kristol, who was the editor of the journal The Public Interest, and Norman Podhoretz, who edited Commentary magazine for 35 years. Scholars have debated neoconservatism's date of birth. Some say it was in the 1930s when Crystal was a college student dabbling in left-wing ideology, but Crystal himself pegs 1965 as the start of the neoconservative current of thought, for that's when he founded his journal, The Public Interest. Who were the neoconservatives, and what were their main ideas? They were men and women who had started their political lives left of center, as liberals, or in the case of Crystal and some others, as Trotskyites. By the mid-1960s, however, they were questioning prevailing liberal thought, especially the premises of President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs for fighting poverty. They were skeptical about social engineering projects. They warned that the premises of such projects were often simplistic and overly optimistic, and the results were often unintended and negative. Though I intend to focus this lecture on neoconservative thinking in the national security field, the neoconservatives from the beginning devoted a great deal of attention to domestic policy issues. Crystal has written that neoconservatism, I'm quoting, describes the erosion of liberal faith among a relatively small but talented and articulate group of scholars and intellectuals, and the movement of this group, which gradually gained many new recruits, toward a more conservative point of view. Conservative, but different in certain important respects from the traditional conservative of the Republican Party. Crystal says, "We were, most of us, from lower middle class or working class families, children of the Great Depression, veterans, literal or not, of World War II, who accepted the New Deal in principle and had little affection for the kind of isolationism that then permeated American conservatism. We regarded ourselves originally as dissident liberals, dissident because we were skeptical of many of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society initiatives and increasingly disbelieving of the liberal metaphysics, the view of human nature and of social and economic realities on which those programs were based." Close quote. Now, if I had to capture the essence of neoconservatism in a sentence, it is skepticism about all isms. Neoconservatives are not a political party. They don't have, never have had, an agreed upon set of policy prescriptions for domestic or foreign affairs. What they have is a common frame of mind that they bring to the analysis of public policy. Crystal rejected the idea that neoconservatism is an ideology. He said it's a persuasion or a current of thought. The neoconservatives criticized ideological orthodoxies of the left and the right. They set themselves up as opponents of political ideologues of all stripes. Now, different people use the term ideologue differently. It usually has a negative connotation. When the term ideology is used negatively, it generally refers to a set of ideas that are premised on assumptions that people hold as a matter of faith, not reason. Though dictionaries generally define ideologue neutrally as a person interested in ideas, it's clearly not a compliment to call someone an ideologue. And therefore, I define an ideologue as a person to whom the facts don't matter. In other words, when an ideologue has theories or preconceptions that are contradicted by facts, the ideologue does not modify his assumptions, rather, he ignores or suppresses the facts. As the saying goes, you can't reason a man out of something he didn't reason himself into. Neoconservatism can be seen as the repudiation of such ideological thinking about public policy. The reason that Crystal and his fellow neoconservatives in the mid-1960s soured on Great Society political liberalism was not that they became indifferent to the poor or decided that the poor did not deserve help from the government. Rather, it was because they examined the actual effects of Great Society programs and concluded that many were doing more harm than good. The neoconservatives were more concerned with results than intentions, which is another way of saying they were anti-ideological. But as I said, I want to focus not on domestic policy issues, but on national security issues, which is the area of my personal experience. Now, I've reviewed the syllabus that Professor Factor has given you and looked over the assignments for today, which I assume you all have practically memorized. They are well selected, but they're challenging. And the discussions of philosophy are in places rather abstract. So unless you're from a clan of political philosophy professors, I can easily imagine that you're reading the material and wondering how many folks in the real world can make heads or tails of this stuff. You may question whether the philosophy has much, if any, practical effect on ordinary people. So in the hope of making the subject a little less abstract, I'd like to talk about the neoconservative movement in the first person, from my own experience. My political evolution toward neoconservatism was similar to that of many others in my generation, so I offer it to you as not just personal history, but kind of as a prototype. Now, let me share with you some of my family background. My father was a Jew born in Europe in 1914. The Nazis killed both of his parents, 3 of his sisters, and his 3 brothers. He came to the United States during World War II and joined the U.S. Merchant Marine, and in the course of the war, he survived the loss of 3 ships to enemy fire. My mother was born in the United States. My parents together created a rather typical Jewish suburban liberal home. The New York Times was delivered every day, and we read it and believed it. My mother thought that Alger Hiss was innocent, and the Rosenbergs probably were too. My parents voted for Adlai Stevenson, for John Kennedy, for Lyndon Johnson. I remember once sitting on the edge of my father's bed with him, looking through papers in his night table, and he had cards showing that he was a member or contributor to the American Civil Liberties Union, the NAACP, and the Democratic Party. I grew up with liberal ideas on the major political issues of the day. At the same time, our home had important conservative features. My parents were patriotic. They gave their children religious instruction, a strong sense of family, a commitment to bourgeois principles of hard work and personal responsibility. We didn't think of them as bourgeois, but there were people who did. When I was a kid in the early 1960s, being a liberal meant supporting colorblind government, free speech, a strong American defense, and friendly relations with Israel. If one supports all of that nowadays, one is considered a conservative. When I was a kid, liberals like ourselves readily accepted the idea that America is an exceptional country, in that it was founded with a mission not only to safeguard its own people's liberty, but to demonstrate to the world the success of popular self-government. Liberals nowadays tend to ridicule or belittle the concept of American exceptionalism, arguing that it's arrogant. I was in high school in the late 1960s and in college in the early 1970s. These years, of course, were dominated by the remarkably bitter controversy about the Vietnam War. Though America's involvement in the war was the work of Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, both of whom were liberal Democrats, liberals turned against the war, and the anti-war movement became increasingly strident and radical. Anti-war demonstrations routinely featured speakers who denounced President Johnson as a war criminal, condemned America as an imperialist aggressor, and sympathized with America's communist enemies. As a high schooler, I was prepared to enter the Army if drafted, but my views on the war were negative, generally in line with those of the liberal editorial page of the New York Times. I considered myself a Democrat, and in fact, I don't think I had a single friend who was a Republican. And I wasn't aware that any of my parents' friends were Republicans. But I found myself increasingly uneasy about what I was hearing from my fellow Democrats. The Democratic Party was assimilating the rhetoric and ideas of the anti-war movement, of the New Left, and of the 1960s counterculture. In 1968, support in the Democratic primaries for peace candidate Eugene McCarthy was sufficient to induce Lyndon Johnson to decide not even to try to win the Democratic nomination for president. And by 1972, the strength of the new left wing of the party was great enough to bring about the nomination of George McGovern to run against Richard Nixon. During college, in the innumerable discussions of Vietnam, much of the anti-war argumentation initially struck me as persuasive. I didn't see how that remote war could greatly affect us at home. The famous domino theory was so thoroughly ridiculed that I dismissed it. President Nixon himself was an unappealing character who lacked credibility even before the Watergate scandal broke. When I entered college, I knew very little history and had not thought deeply about foreign affairs. But like everyone else, I participated in endless discussions of the Vietnam War. Much of the anti-war argumentation still sounded persuasive to me, but two things in particular caused me to move away from the anti-war cause. First, I was repelled by the prevalence of extremist anti-American rhetoric. For example, the condemnation of US officials as fascists and the spelling of America with a K to make the whole country appear fascist. By the attacks on capitalism and the bourgeoisie, and by the sympathy expressed toward the Soviet Union, which I knew to be an inhumane totalitarian state. Secondly, and of critical importance for me, I came to realize that pacifist notions underlay much of the argumentation of the anti-war left. You remember the slogans: nothing ever gets resolved by force. War is not the answer. Now, as limited as was my knowledge about history, I had a bedrock understanding, given my family history, that there were some forces for evil in the world that could not be contained, much less eliminated, through diplomacy and blandishments. The Nazi regime and the Soviet regime each had its own totalitarian revolutionary ideology and its record of murdering millions. I knew that diplomacy, though tried far beyond the point of reasonableness, couldn't solve the Hitler problem. I knew that the Nazi threat was, in fact, resolved by force. I knew that the Soviet Union was a serious enemy too, able and willing to use military power to spread its influence. And I knew, therefore, that whether war was the answer depended on what the question was. When someone asserted that war was never the answer, it registered with me as the proverbial 13th chime of a clock, which calls into question the integrity of all the previous chimes. All kinds of theories can be very seductive when one knows very few facts. An impressive teacher can easily make a complex theory sound compelling to a student who has no substantial knowledge in the field. I had started college as a physics major and was trained in the scientific method. I had assimilated the lesson that theories are simply hypotheses until they are rigorously tested against the facts. There were few major historical points I felt confident I knew to be facts, but the idea that Hitler had to be resisted with force was one of them. The pacifism that was an element of so much anti-war argumentation was the flaw that caused me to look with intense skepticism at all the key arguments of the anti-war movement. Those arguments began to unravel in my mind, and I became open to rethink everything I thought I knew about foreign policy and government. I expanded my reading beyond the New York Times and other liberal publications. Of greatest significance, I became a regular reader of Commentary magazine. Now, reading commentary got me intellectually into neoconservative circles. And I'll tell you the story of how I entered physically, as it were, into those circles in Washington, D.C. The story begins in a situation like the one we're currently in, a guest lecture at a college. In my senior year of college, I was an undergraduate at Harvard. I heard from a friend that the diplomatic correspondent of the New York Times, a man named Leslie Gelb, was going to be giving a guest lecture at the great girls' school, Wellesley. One never passed up an opportunity to go to Wellesley. And so I said I'd be happy to go there and attend the lecture. And the lecture was on, I remember to this day the title, Détente, Entente, and Irrelevant Diplomacy. And when it was over, a number of us went out to a Chinese dinner with Mr. Gelb. And in the course of the dinner, I asked a number of skeptical questions about the Ford administration's the détente policy, the policy toward the Soviet Union. And after a few minutes, Mr. Gelb said to me, you know, with views like yours, you should be working for Senator Henry Jackson. And he said, I know Senator Jackson's national security staff guy, Richard Pearl, and he said, if you send me your resume, I'll send it to Pearl. Now, Senator Jackson was an impeccably credentialed liberal Democrat with a purity rating in like the 90% range from the very liberal Americans for Democratic Action. He was also a defense hawk and the Senate's leading voice of opposition to the Soviet Union. Senator Jackson was deeply skeptical of the Nixon-Kissinger détente policy. He brilliantly dissected the Nixon administration's arms control treaties with the Soviet Union and laid open their flaws. He publicized the Soviet regime's failures and brutalities, especially its mistreatment of pro-democracy dissidents and its refusal to allow oppressed Jews to emigrate from the Soviet Union to Israel. He successfully pushed for enactment of a law called the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which made most favored nation trade status for the Soviet Union conditional on Moscow's granting emigration rights to Soviet Jews. Jackson showed how highlighting human rights can be used to galvanize popular American support for an assertive foreign policy and to undermine the standing of America's anti-democratic enemies. As the Vietnam War wound down and then ended in 1975 with the North Vietnamese conquest of South Vietnam, the main national security debates in the United States shifted their focus to policy toward the Soviet Union. The neoconservatives, having broken with the Democrats over their lurch leftward under the leadership of George McGovern and others, were by no means comfortable with the Republican administration's policy toward the Soviet Union. I hope you notice that I'm telling you over and over again how the neoconservatives actually positioned themselves, or found themselves positioned, between the leftists in the Democratic Party and the traditional conservatives in the Republican Party. And the neoconservatives were consistently in a kind of centrist position. This is obviously very important because the term neoconservative in recent years, and we'll get to this later, has suggested that, that it represents, somehow a position on the fringe. But I want you to note this throughout. Now, you'll recall that I mentioned Norman Podhoretz, the editor of Commentary magazine, as one of the main figures in neoconservatism. I'd like to quote at some length Podhoretz's description of the Nixon-Kissinger policy of relaxation of tensions with the Soviet Union, a policy known as détente. In light of the strong popular opposition to the Vietnam War and the U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam, Podhoretz wrote, the United States, quote, had to find a way to restrain Soviet expansionism that did not depend entirely or even largely on the use or the threatened use of American military power. This new strategy, as Nixon and Kissinger conceived it, was composed of two tactical strands. The first, and more important, was to offer incentives, mainly consisting of economic benefits, for Soviet moderation and restraint, and to threaten penalties, mainly consisting of the withdrawal of those benefits, for aggressive or adventurous activity. This, in essence, was what détente meant. I'm continuing with the quote from Podhoretz. The second tactical strand of the new strategy for containing the Soviet Union, at a time of diminishing American power and will, was the so-called Nixon Doctrine. This entailed finding regional allies or surrogates who would assume the responsibility for deterring Soviet expansionist moves and, if necessary, resisting them by force. The United States would supply arms for this purpose, but such regional surrogates as Iran under the Shah would do the rest. The opening to China, whatever else it may have been intended to accomplish, and there were undoubtedly many reasons for the move, has to be understood in the first instance as a product of the Nixon Doctrine. Close quote. Podhoretz was the key neoconservative intellectual critic of the Nixon administration's strategy toward the Soviet Union. One might say of this strategy, Podhoretz wrote, what Edmund Burke said of Lord North's treatment of the American colonies. This fine-spun scheme had the usual fate of all exquisite policy. Podhoretz continued, brilliant though it was in achieving perfect internal coherence, it failed because it misjudged the nature of the Soviet threat on the one side and the nature of American public opinion on the other. Podhoretz noted that neither Nixon nor Kissinger had any sympathy for the Soviets, nor did they ever doubt, and this is his quote, nor did they ever doubt that the Soviet Union had expansionist aims or that it was capable of great ruthlessness in the pursuit of those aims. While both men, quote, always make their obeisances to the role of ideology in determining Soviet behavior on the international scene, for the most part, they saw the Soviet Union as a nation-state like any other, motivated by the same range of interests that define and shape the foreign policies of all nation-states. From this perspective, the perspective of realpolitik, Communist Russia was not all that different from Tsarist Russia. The facts of geography, history, and ancestral culture being far more decisive than the ideas of Marx and Lenin. Close quote. Here is the essence of the neoconservative critique of the Nixon-Kissinger foreign policy. The neoconservatives believed that the so-called realist realpolitik school of international relations, which argued that nations act on the basis of objective material interests in promoting their military and economic power, and their respective ideologies and forms of government have little to do in determining their actions, was altogether inadequate to explain the behavior of ideological regimes like that of the Nazis or the Soviets. Podhoretz wrote that if the Soviet leaders behaved in accordance with realpolitik, not in accordance with communist ideology, then, quote, it would certainly be possible to make a deal of the kind contemplated by the policy of détente. If, in other words, Podhoretz wrote, the aims of the Soviet Union were limited, they could be respected and even to a certain extent satisfied through negotiation and compromise, with the resultant settlement policed by means other than and short of actual military force. But, Podhoretz continued, what if the Soviet Union is not a normal nation-state? What if, in this case, ideology overrides interest in the traditional sense? What if the Soviet aims are unlimited? In short, and to bring up the by now familiar contending comparisons, what if the Soviet Union bears a closer resemblance to the Germany of Hitler than to the Germany of Kaiser Wilhelm? Wilhelmine Germany was an expansionist power seeking a place in the imperial sun and nothing more than that. Hitler, by contrast, and again I'm quoting Podhoretz at length here, Hitler, by contrast, was a revolutionary, seeking to overturn the going international system and to replace it with a new order dominated by Germany, which also meant the political culture of Nazism. For tactical reasons and in order to mislead, Hitler sometimes pretended that all he wanted was the satisfaction of specific grievances, and those who were taken in by this pretense not unreasonably thought they could do business with him. But there was no way of doing business, that is, negotiating a peaceful settlement, with Hitler. As a revolutionary with unlimited aims, he offered only two choices: resistance or submission. Close quote. Podhoretz argued that the Soviet Union posed the same kind of threat to the West. Neoconservatives believed in the importance of ideas not just military and economic interests in world affairs. One of their main contributions to national security thinking was to emphasize the role of ideology in national security affairs. This was important to understand the motivations of ideological regimes in the world, and also to bring to the fore the moral dimension of national security policy for Americans and for citizens of other democratic countries. Whereas the so-called realists spoke of the Cold War as essentially a clash of great powers, the conservatives spoke of it, the neoconservatives spoke of it as a battle between liberal democracy and totalitarian communism. The realists often referred to the Soviet Union simply as Russia, as a way of de-emphasizing the ideological nature of the regime in Moscow. Podhoretz argued that that regime has committed itself by word and deed to the creation of a socialist world. He went on, quote, "There is no reason to think it can be talked out of this commitment, or even, as at bottom détente assumes, bribed out of it. It may well be, as we are often told, that the Soviet leaders no longer believe subjectively in communism. But whatever they say to themselves in the privacy of their own minds, they are, to borrow from their own vocabulary, objectively the prisoners of Marxian and Leninist doctrines. Without these doctrines, which mandate steady international advances in the cause of socialism, they have no way to legitimize their monopoly of power within the Soviet Union itself. Hence, even if they wanted to limit their aims and become a status quo power, they would be unable to do so without committing political suicide. What this means is that the conflict between the Soviet Union and the West is not subject to resolution by the traditional tools of diplomacy. Or to put it another way, given the nature of the Soviet threat, détente is not possible. Certain agreements may be possible from time to time, but they will invariably cover ground, cultural exchanges, arrangements for travel and communications and the like, that is peripheral or even trivial from the point of view of the central issue. Where really important ground is touched upon, the agreement will invariably result in a Soviet advantage, Podhoretz wrote. This is not because the Soviets are necessarily better at negotiating than we are, or because they will necessarily cheat. They may or may not be better, and they may or may not cheat. It is rather because in any negotiation between a party with limited aims and a party with unlimited aims, the party with limited aims is bound to lose in the very nature of things. Even a deal that on the surface promises mutual benefits will work out to the advantage of the side pursuing a strategy of victory over the side pursuing a strategy of accommodation and peace." Close quote. I argue that it is hard to overstate the importance of this neoconservative critique of the Nixon administration's strategy toward the Soviet Union. It brought together practical political leaders like Senator Jackson with intellectuals like Podhoretz, Professor Gene Kirkpatrick of Georgetown University, and Professor Eugene V. Rostow of Yale Law School. The two main national security points made by the neoconservatives in the 1970s can be summarized in a few words. First, ideas have consequences. Ideas matter. This is to say that the so-called realist school is not realistic when it overemphasizes the importance of guns and money, as it were, and de-emphasizes the importance in world affairs of ideology, ignoring or downplaying America's practical as well as moral interest in supporting individual rights and democracy abroad. The second main neoconservative point is captured by the slogan, "Peace through strength." This is not only an answer to pacifists who deny the relationship between peace and military power, but also a skeptical observation about diplomacy. In stressing peace through strength, neoconservatives were not making an argument against diplomacy, and no sensible person is against diplomacy, but they were warning that diplomacy alone cannot be expected to produce or sustain peace if unsupported by military power. When Ronald Reagan challenged Gerald Ford for the Republican nomination for president in 1976, an unsuccessful challenge, he drew heavily on the critique of the détente policies of Nixon and Kissinger. After Nixon resigned in 1974, Kissinger remained as Secretary of State throughout Ford's presidency. Reagan often sounded both of the major neoconservative themes, ideas matter and peace through strength. During the years of the Jimmy Carter administration, neoconservatives criticized President Carter for failures relating to both of these themes. Carter did not appear to understand the Soviet Union and the ideological nature of the Cold War. President Carter warned against Americans' inordinate fear of communism, one of his most famous remarks. He famously kissed Leonid Brezhnev, literally, at one of their summit meetings. He admitted to being shocked by the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan on Christmas Day in 1979, and said something along the lines of he learned more about the Soviet Union in 5 minutes after the invasion than in his whole life previously. It was not confidence-inspiring. Carter also lacked appreciation of the concept of peace through strength. His diplomacy was naive, as was especially evident in his efforts to bring the Soviet Union into the Arab-Israeli peace talks. And even though Carter became famous for hosting the Israeli-Egyptian negotiations that produced the Camp David Accords and eventually the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, careful students of the subject remembered that Carter administration officials at first strongly opposed the peace initiative of Egyptian President Sadat on the grounds that a separate bilateral peace would impede negotiation of a comprehensive Arab-Israeli peace. The crowning example of President Carter's weakness was in the Iran hostage crisis. After Iranian followers of the Ayatollah Khomeini broke into the US embassy in Tehran and held a large group of diplomats and embassy officers hostage for over 14 months. Neoconservatives were important voices of opposition to the national security policies of the Carter administration. Former military and civilian officials, many of whom served formally or informally as advisors to Democratic Senators Henry Jackson, Hubert Humphrey, and Daniel Patrick Moynihan, formed organizations in the Carter years, such as the Committee on the Present Danger and the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, that used neoconservative argumentation against what they saw as the naivete, weakness, and anti-Israel inclinations of the Carter administration. In the 1980 presidential election, because of the still unresolved Iranian hostage crisis, foreign policy was a prominent element, and Ronald Reagan deployed against Jimmy Carter a critique that drew heavily on the themes that neoconservatives had developed to oppose the policies of Carter and Nixon. When Reagan was elected, he appointed many neoconservatives to positions in his administration. For example, Gene Kirkpatrick became U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. William Bennett became drug czar and then Secretary of Education. Eugene Rostow became director of the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. Elliott Abrams and Paul Wolfowitz became assistant secretaries of state. Richard Pearl became an assistant secretary of defense. And I, still a very junior member of the neoconservative community, became a member of the National Security Council staff and, as you heard, eventually a deputy assistant secretary of defense. There were quite a few others as well. It was after Ronald Reagan became president that the term neocon became widely used. It was a useful term because it shed light on the sociology of the Reagan administration. Reagan's supporters and officials could be divided into neoconservatives, a fairly small group of intellectuals who, because of their writings, had disproportionate intellectual influence, and ordinary conservatives, who were sometimes laughingly called paleoconservatives. These groups had different backgrounds. Again, the neoconservatives were people who started their lives as liberals or far leftists. They were not the people who, as youngsters, belonged to the Young Americans for Freedom, a conservative organization. The neoconservatives were disproportionately, though by no means exclusively, Jewish. They were people, by and large, who read, and some wrote for, Commentary magazine, as opposed to the people who grew up reading William Buckley's National Review. So they were new or neo-conservatives, not lifelong conservatives. Now, the neoconservatives had no connection with the conservative history of support for isolationism or opposition to civil rights. And the neoconservatives believed that this last point could help Reagan increase his support among other groups that had long been anti-Republican. So the term neoconservative, as I said, during the Reagan years was useful because of these different sociologies, as it were, of the different groups of important, influential Reagan supporters. Interestingly enough, the neoconservatives and the lifelong conservatives generally got along well in the Reagan administration. The strategy that President Reagan pursued against the Soviet Union was the neoconservative strategy, proposed by people like Podhoretz, Richard Pearl, Admiral Elmo Zumwalt, Senator Jackson, and others throughout the 1990s. The main point of the strategy was the repudiation of the Nixon administration goals of stabilizing U.S. relations with the Soviet Union and relaxing tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. Reagan's goal was victory. He was once asked what his strategy is, and he famously responded that it's simple. We win, they lose. Now, this sounded flip, but it was serious. And it was based on the appreciation common to the neoconservatives and to Reagan that Soviet communism and the Marxist ideology on which it was based was rife with internal contradictions, to borrow a good Marxist phrase. Like the neoconservatives, Reagan believed that Marxism-Leninism was premised on misconceptions about the nature of human beings. It aimed to create the new Soviet man, an unnatural being who could be brought into being only through enormous efforts at coercion. Reagan believed that even through coercion, the communists would not succeed in changing the nature of the human being, who is a self-serving creature, even though capable of virtuous action. And Reagan further believed that the coercion was ultimately unsustainable and the natural desire of people to be free would defeat the communist efforts to turn all of society into a press that could squeeze the public into a new human mold. That's why he made his famous comment that communism would wind up on the ash heap of history, borrowing another good communist phrase. Note that this weaving together of philosophical and practical strategic thoughts is the hallmark of neoconservatism and distinguished the neoconservatives from the traditional conservatives of the realpolitik school. Let's reflect for a moment on the magnitude of the accomplishment Reagan achieved with his Soviet strategy. He helped destroy the Soviet Union utterly. He ended the nuclear balance of terror. He achieved what I think we could say was the greatest strategic victory in the history of the world. For he not only defeated his enemy, but destroyed the Soviet Union as a state, and he did so without war. The way he implemented this strategy was through multiple means. Trade restrictions, for example, including economic measures like opposing the building of the Soviet gas pipeline to Western Europe, putting export controls on high technology, arming the anti-Soviet forces in Afghanistan, getting NATO to support deployment of intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Europe, the building of missile defense, which was at the time known by critics of the Reagan administration as Star Wars, exposing Soviet human rights violations, embarrassing the Soviets politically before the world when they did things like shoot down the civilian Korean airliner, and encouraging the dissidents who were demanding democracy and respect for individual liberties. Now, these last 2 points in particular regarding human rights and democracy promotion were crucial to moving Gorbachev to launch the experiments in glasnost, openness, and perestroika, reconstruction, that led to the crumbling of the authority of the Soviet leadership and the disintegration of the Soviet Union. These last 2 points were quintessential neoconservatism in action. In the Reagan years, the thinking of neoconservatives and other conservatives generally melded to the point that neoconservatism could reasonably be called simply Reaganite thinking. By the mid-1990s, Crystal could write, "It's clear that what can fairly be described as the neoconservative impulse, or at most the neoconservative persuasion, was a generational phenomenon and has now been pretty much absorbed into a larger, more comprehensive conservatism." But the term neocon came back into widespread use after George W. Bush's election. It became a useful handle for journalists and others because they wanted, at first, to understand what was going to be the philosophical makeup of the new George W. Bush administration. They were wondering whether the Reaganites would predominate or whether it would be the traditional conservatives of the realist school, people aligned with George H.W. Bush, James Baker, Brent Scowcroft. It turns out that George W. Bush was in many ways a Reaganite. Especially after 9/11, he believed in a highly active US national security policy. He believed in peace through strength. He saw military power as inherently necessary and as a crucial component of effective diplomacy with hostile powers. In confronting America's enemies, he was willing to pursue victory and not just stability. But the term neocon quickly lost its integrity during the George W. Bush years. First of all, it began to acquire a bigoted connotation. because George W. Bush was strongly pro-Israel, and because the neoconservatives were, as I mentioned, disproportionately, though not exclusively, Jewish, critics of the president began to use neocon as a term of contempt to imply that the person in question was a Jew with loyalty to Israel rather than to the United States. Satirizing the bigots, the New York Times columnist David Brooks wrote an article early in the Bush years that defined neocon as follows. Con, Brooks wrote, is short for conservative, and neo is short for Jew. The term then became merely an epithet, a verbal piece of nastiness that could be used to smear officials whom the speaker thought were too hardline or too militaristic. I mean, it became as meaningful as fascist. I mean, when people in the 1960s were called fascists, nobody thought that that actually meant that they were, members of the National Socialist Party. It's just, it was a term of abuse. And likewise, the term neocon, without any reference to what it actually means or who the people were that were really neocons once, became used the way fascist was used. Now, there were attributed to neocons, and especially to the neocon officials in the George W. Bush administration, ideas that we didn't hold and actions that we never took. The neocon officials have been falsely accused of having pushed for war without considering options short of war. It's widely but falsely believed that neocon officials advocated spreading democracy by the sword, and that we favored war against Saddam in order to democratize the Arab world. That the emphasis, in other words, was not on protecting the United States from threats, but doing a political experiment in the Middle East. It's also widely but falsely reported that the neocons in the Bush administration argued that war in Iraq would be easy and that there was no need to plan for the post-Saddam period. All of these notions are false, and if one wants to read the documents that demonstrate their inaccuracy, I suggest you review my book. I mean, it's laid out in detail, quoting from the original documents. And you can see the actual argumentation that we used and how in many cases we explicitly repudiated these ideas that are now commonly attributed to us. One of the many books that paint an inaccurate picture on this subject, and one that's especially noteworthy, is a book called America at the Crossroads by Francis Fukuyama. Fukuyama is a prominent scholar, a truly brilliant scholar, and he was a neocon in an earlier stage of his career, before he recanted. And in his book, he makes the inaccurate attributions that I just mentioned. Now, what is remarkable, and this I want to emphasize to you because it's not only relevant to this subject, but it's an object lesson. What's interesting is he attributes these ideas to the neocon officials in the Bush administration. And I was interested in that because, to tell you the truth, if you think about it, there were really only a handful of people. I mean, literally, 4 or 5 or so, who were neocons at a fairly high level in the George W. Bush administration. And by the way, many of them reject the term, and so it's kind of a question of as to who qualifies. I'm one of the few people who will tell you, yes, I was in fact a neoconservative. And I guess I remain one, but the term is, for all practical purposes, I think, kaput. But what's interesting is as I said, there's a very small group there were actually neocons in the higher levels of the Bush administration. And when I looked at Fukuyama's book, I noticed that there is not a single sentence, not a word quoted from any of us. And yet he attributes all these thoughts to us, that we thought Iraq was going to be easy, that we didn't think planning for post-Saddam Iraq was necessary, when in fact we said the opposite. We wrote voluminously to the contrary in memos. And it's a lesson because it should be a lesson for all of you in critical reading. If you want to take subjects seriously and read books and credit them, ask yourself, what are the sources? What's the quality of the sources? One thing that's particularly interesting is what is done in this book is there are extensive quotations. The main theme of the book is that the neoconservatives developed a set of brilliant ideas, and he does a very good job of explaining the development of neoconservative thought. And then he says these brilliant ideas were taken off the tracks by neoconservative officials in the Bush administration. That's his thesis. But he doesn't quote, as I said, a word from any of the neoconservative officials. What he quotes are neoconservative journalists. And I assume I don't have to drive home to you how unfair it is to have attributed to one quotes that came from somebody else. And one is not, as an official, responsible for what journalists are saying. And so anyway, it's just, as I said, I think it's an important point because I want to make the point to correct the record, and I want to emphasize to you the importance of checking people's sources, finding out the quality of their footnotes, if you're really going to be taking seriously anything that you read in the newspaper or in books. And I will end by simply saying that this whole talk should serve for you as a warning about political labels. Because, as I said, I think that the term neoconservative now is essentially meaningless because of the way it was used, abused, misapplied by innumerable people who used it as a term of opprobrium, as an insult during the George W. Bush administration. And so it's an interesting point about political labels. And one should be careful about that. And on that note, I'll just remind you of a story that Abraham Lincoln used to tell where he said, if you call a dog's tail a leg, how many legs does a dog have? And the answer is 4, because calling a dog's tail a leg doesn't make it a leg. Thank you.
Outstanding. Outstanding. Thank you so much. This is the book that has all the original sources in it that I strongly urge you to read. It is fabulous, War and Decision. Douglas J. Feith. Doug Feith, thank you so much for being here. That was so interesting. I have never heard neoconservatism explained like that. And we'll be right back with questions and answers.
Thank you.
With me today is Douglas J. Feith. Doug Feith was inside the Pentagon at the dawn of the war on terrorism, and he actually wrote a book about it, War and Decision, which is absolutely fabulous. But we're here to talk about neoconservatism in general. So, gentlemen, question? Cadet Selmaska.
Sir, you spoke and said America has the opportunity to serve as an example to the free world, or to the whole world, on the virtue and the legitimacy of free government, popular government. What specific role would the neoconservatives say that the military has a role in that end, if any at all?
Well, first of all, let me make the point that my authority for the idea that that's what America is about is Abraham Lincoln. And if you recall the Gettysburg Address, one of the most remarkable things about the Gettysburg Address is how he says that part of the reason that it's important that the Union win is, he says, because and he specifically makes reference to not just what will happen within the United States, but he says we essentially owe it to the world to demonstrate that government of, by, and for the people can work. And I just, within the last few days, completed the Ron Chernow biography of George Washington, which I commend to everybody here. It's absolutely terrific work. And George Washington made the same point. And it's absolutely fascinating that this idea that the American founding fathers believed that they not only owed it to their own community to create self-government to protect the liberties of their people, but they were doing something that would demonstrate to the world the possibility of popular self-government. And so anyway, that first of all is I want to make it clear, this is not a neocon idea. This is George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and it's a part of the American tradition that's very deep and important. Where the military comes in is, I mean, when we've had opportunities to have major effects on helping to transform countries from anti-democratic rule to democracy, it's generally been in the aftermath of war. And so, I mean, one of the obvious examples is World War II. We did not enter World War II in order to democratize Germany and Japan. We entered World War II because we were attacked, and the Germans declared war on us after Pearl Harbor. And so we entered the war for other reasons. But once we were in the war, the question arises, what do you do after you defeat the enemy? And I think it was a properly strategic view that what our military should be helping do after we defeat the enemy, working with other parts of the government, but the military had a major role, was lay the foundation for the creation of liberal democratic institutions in those countries. And I would say the same thing happened with Iraq. We did not, contrary to what some people accused the Bush administration of, we did not go to war in Iraq in order to democratize Iraq. We went to war in Iraq to eliminate the threats that the Saddam Hussein regime posed to the United States. But once we went to war and it was clear that we were going to get rid of the regime, the question arises, what do you put in its place? And as Americans, it was natural that we were going to attempt to encourage democratic institutions. Now, I use the term encourage on purpose because it's not realistic to say that we're going to create democracy for other people. Democracy is very complex, it's hard to create, and if people don't want it for themselves, they're not going to have it. And nothing you can do, you can't impose democracy on people. You can defeat them, you can create the circumstance where democracy might arise, but if the people don't want to create it for themselves, it's not going to happen. And so I think that is some sense of where, what I think the role of the military is.
Before we get to our next cadet's question, I look at the key features of neoconservatism as economic growth, and all conservatives believe in that, I think. I look at it as strengthening the social order, the moral fabric of society through policy, and the vast majority of conservatives, if you get to the objectivists, maybe they have some questions about that, but in general, even libertarians believe in that. But going further, neoconservatives are thought to believe in a robust foreign policy guided by American ideals, where intervention can be used. And lastly, the fourth part, and this is Irving Kristol, I'm quoting, saving the welfare state. How does that jive with the libertarians, the paleo-conservatives, and the cultural conservatives?
It's a large question, but let me take a stab at it.
I'm really talking about the saving the welfare state and a robust intervention policy.
I mean, one of the ways to think about neoconservative thoughts and the contribution of neoconservatives to the public debate is the emphasis on moral considerations in both domestic policy and foreign policy. I have explained that this idea that we are a democracy matters. The idea that our enemies are totalitarians matters. There's a philosophical and a moral component, and taking the ideology of our enemies seriously matters, as was the case when the neocons championed the support for dissidents in the Soviet Union. So that element of morality. Likewise, in the domestic area, one of the things that distinguishes the neocons, let's say, from the libertarians, by and large, and of course, whenever we're talking here, we're talking generalizations, so we have to be careful about labels. You need labels to have a discussion, but you should also be skeptical of the labels that you use, so let's keep that in mind. But libertarians, by and large, do not discuss morality. Right? Libertarians look back intellectually to Bentham, right? To the argument of utility. Mm-hmm. And if you talk to a libertarian and you say things like, well, what about moral laws like thou shalt not kill? They'll say, that's not a matter of morality. That's a matter of practicality. You can't have a functioning society if people are allowed to kill. Okay, so that's an approach. That's not the neocons' approach. The neocons tend to talk about the importance of morality in society and the religious basis for the moral thinking of most people. And that ties into the point about capitalism and about the welfare state. Very often when one hears libertarians talking about the economy, they talk about how much good is done by the profit motive. And when they talk about good, it almost implies that they're arguing that it's morally good, that people pursuing their selfish interests is somehow a morally good thing. What neocon writers, and Irving Kristol has been particularly articulate on the point, stress, and he's written an essay specifically on this point, saying the profit motive is not good. Mm-hmm. It is simply natural. It's an instinct that people have to better themselves, materially. But it's not good. It's not virtuous. What Adam Smith points out is in a properly organized society where you have free markets, the people pursuing their own selfish interests can have the effect of bettering all of society. But that doesn't make pursuing your selfish interests virtuous. It just observes that pursuing your selfish interests is what you do naturally. And he even likens it to a sexual urge. I mean, sexual urges are sexual urges. The urge to acquire property is an urge like that. It's not, you don't talk about it as good or bad. It just is what it is. And the question is, how do you create a society that takes the world as it is and tries to produce praiseworthy or virtuous results? And that's the argument. And Adam Smith himself made the argument that you need to have, for a well-functioning free market society, you need to have inhabitants of that society who have self-discipline and virtue. Mm-hmm. And that if everybody in society is just selfish and pursuing instant gratification, for example, you won't have investment. You won't have the kinds of things that make a free market system successful in producing prosperity. And so there's an important moral and discipline component, even in the, the teachings of the father of the free market theories. And then when it comes to the welfare state, what Crystal and others have written is one of the main distinctions between the neoconservatives and the traditional conservatives is that the traditional conservatives tended to oppose the New Deal. Mm-hmm. And they tended to oppose the idea that the government has a responsibility to take care of poor people, right? Traditional conservatives tended to emphasize that it's important that there be charity, right? Mm-hmm. Traditional conservatives were in favor of private charity, but they were generally not in favor of government-provided welfare. The neoconservatives tended to say that while private charity is a very good thing and in many ways is a better thing than government welfare, there is a role in society for the government to help poor people. And that's why I made the point in my talk that when the neoconservatives, to a large extent, coalesced in opposition to Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs, they did so not because they opposed the idea of government assistance for poor people, but because on a purely kind of scientific or pragmatic basis, they believed those programs were creating more pathologies than they were mitigating. I mean, they were doing more harm than good. And so the argument was not the government shouldn't be in this business, which is a libertarian kind of argument. They were simply saying, don't organize welfare programs that encourage people, men, to desert their families. Right? Don't have welfare programs that have the effect of incentivizing crime. And that kind of thing. So they were actually looking at the practical effects of the programs rather than making a principled argument that the government shouldn't be helping the poor. And that's why I think Crystal emphasized in the quote that you made that the neoconservatives were looking for ways to improve or make possible the sustainability of the welfare state rather than end it.
I guess we've heard from a number of speakers that the Republican Party, conservatism was, and the two are not synonymous by any means, but were built on a three-legged stool. I'd even go as far as saying 4 legs. But if we look at the 3 major legs, the cultural conservatives, the libertarians, and the neoconservatives and we could also say the paleo-conservatives as well, the old Jeffersonian agrarian types, but let's take the 3 legs. Can those 3 legs support that stool, or do you see the neoconservatives breaking from possibly the libertarians and cultural conservatives? And I'll go one step. I'll go one step further, if I may. If you look at some of the major conservative organizations, at one point there was a little more representation of the neoconservative view than there is today. There's almost none in a number of organizations.
Well,
let's take Cato as an example. It's an extreme opposite of.
Yeah, Cato was not a neocon
No, I'm
operation
saying
ever.
but there's no representation whatsoever.
Right.
It doesn't make. I'm not commenting if it's bad or good. So can that stay?
Well, I mean, the first thing I would say is Irving Kristol, as I quoted in 1995, said neoconservatism is a generational phenomenon. It's over. The neoconservatives have just merged into the general conservative community. And he wrote that in 1995. I think he's right.
Okay, so
and
there isn't that separation
I don't think there was any revival of a distinct neoconservative school in the Bush years. All you had was a revival of the use of the term. And the revival of, I tried to explain that the revival of the use of the term initially made some sense because people wanted to know, is George W. Bush going to appoint Reaganites or is he going to appoint people that are like, Baker Scowcroft people? And that's a perfectly reasonable thing. I wondered it myself. I was looking around to see who he was going to appoint. And And then people use the term neocon more or less to mean Reaganite. And for that one little moment at the beginning of the formation of the Bush administration, you could say the term had a well-justified, momentary revival. It quickly lost its utility and became, as I said, a bigoted term and just like a swear word. So the term has essentially been destroyed. But the term got revived and then destroyed after the neoconservative, whatever you want to call it, current of thought or school of thought had already basically merged into general conservative thought. Because the neoconservative ideas, which were generated in the public interest and in Commentary magazine, became so widely adopted in conservative circles that you had lots of people espousing them who had nothing to do with neoconservatism, but the ideas simply made sense. And so people who didn't come from the particular sociology that I described and didn't start their political life left of center began to say things that had 10 or 20 years before been considered neoconservative ideas, but then they just became conservative ideas. And so, in my view, when you're talking about the different elements or the legs of the conservative movement, there remains traditional or Tory conservatism. There remains libertarian conservatism. You got a two-legged stool. I mean, whatever. You want to call them two pillars? You can call them two pillars. I'm not sure the stool analogy works very well when you only have two. But I think those are the two main elements of conservative thinking today, or the conservative party, the Republican Party today. The two main elements are conservatism generally, which includes a lot of the neocon inputs from the recent decades, and the libertarians, who clearly are a distinct strain. And there's been a kind of coexistence of these two groups, and cooperation not always easy between them for very many years.
Would you say that the cultural conservatives and the neoconservatives have kind of melded together?
Well, yeah, to a large extent. I think that's part of what the neocons did was they took the arguments of the cultural conservatives, which had a lot to do with morality, and they gave them an intellectual expression and an intellectual heft that could only make the cultural conservatives delighted. Because the cultural conservatives, people who came in with, Bible Belt conservatives, were often dismissed as intellectually non-serious, because a lot of the intellectuals dismiss anything religious as non-serious. And the neocons were able to come in and explain that these moral considerations that the Bible Belt people are bringing are actually intellectually not only respectable, but crucial to the functioning of a healthy society. And so that that's part of that merger of neoconservatism into general conservative thinking.
Thank you. Mr. Slater, I saw you had a question.
Yes, I do. So talking about that moral consideration and also supporting freedom and democracy, in terms of foreign policy, how do you translate that support into foreign policy? Where do you draw that line? Is it through just statements and resolutions, limited intervention, say in the case of a genocide, or more comprehensive intervention?
Well, I would start not by focusing on policy prescriptions, but focusing on understanding. One of the main things the neocons did, and it gets misrepresented when people talk about the neocons, that people focus, they say, oh, well, the neocons want to be pushing democracy. They want to be spreading democracy by the sword, right? They think we can impose democracy on people. So they're focusing on the policy prescriptions. What should we do here? Should we overthrow the Saudis and try to put a democracy in there? That kind of thing. But the main thing that I would emphasize that the neocons bring to the subject, or have brought to the subject over the years, is simply the argument that if you want to understand how certain types of governments work and what they're likely to do and what they value and how you might be able to predict their actions, understand the importance of ideology. Now, not every government is ideological, but there are some that are very ideological. And revolutionary regimes, like the Nazis, like the fascists, like the communists, like the Islamic Republic of Iran, right? Those revolutionary ideological regimes take their ideology seriously. And it's a major factor in the way they operate. And if you try to analyze a problem that has a large ideological component, strictly in realpolitik terms, looking for where's the financial benefit, where's the military power benefit, you're missing something that's absolutely crucial. And you know, I mean, an example of that in the Arab-Israeli context, we have seen first Britain and then the United States for 100 years pursue essentially a realpolitik approach to trying to promote Arab-Israeli peace, saying to the Arabs, you got to, you know, let's make a deal, right? And the Zionists can actually, you know, build up the land and improve your economic circumstances, so you should welcome them here. And the Arabs kept saying, in a very ideological fashion, for nationalist and religious reasons, it's our land, no compromise. So then people come to them and offer them, well, how about if we change the boundaries? And they say, no. How about if we, you know, restrict Jewish immigration, but going back to the mandate period? No. You know, nowadays we have all these final status issues. How about if we handle the settlements this way? How about if we divide Jerusalem this way? And the answer comes back ideologically over and over again, and the people are deaf to it. It's like a dog whistle, you know? I mean, it's like these people's ears are not attuned to the ideology. And what the neocons were saying is, you need better, you know, receivers. You're not hearing a message that is enormously important. Take ideology seriously. And it was the same thing with the Soviet Union and the approach toward the Soviet Union, that we could just work things out and we want stability, therefore they want stability, when we wanted stability and they wanted victory. And yet you didn't hear that at all from, I mean, there was one agreement that we actually negotiated, the United States negotiated with the Soviet Union in the early 70s, believe it or not, was an agreement that was called something like an agreement to renounce the pursuit of marginal advantages one over the other. I mean, that was almost literally the title of the agreement. Now, I mean, one can look back on that and say, how stupid was that? Right? I mean, you're dealing with an ideological regime. I mean, you really think that these two governments were getting together, both having the same interest in stability? And yet that's the approach. Anyway, what the neocons contributed to the debate was the argument that you're not listening. If you're not hearing the ideological component when it exists, and by the way, as I said, it doesn't always exist. There are governments that operate more or less on realpolitik lines. But if you have a government that doesn't, you're making a big mistake to assume that it does. And so that's really the point more. And then the question, you know, what does that mean for democracy promotion and this and that? I mean, there are a lot of practical reasons for the United States to encourage the spread of democracy around the world. I think we get benefits. When democracy spreads around the world, our own civil liberties at home are safer. So we have a practical interest in the tide of international affairs flowing in favor of greater democracy. I mean, one way to think about it is, after World War I, when you had the Bolshevik Revolution, right? And there was great nervousness about, the spread of anarchy and then communism. What happened in the United States? You had the Palmer raids, you had major infringements, shrinking of American civil liberties. After World War II, when the communists took over Eastern Europe and were reaching out to try to grab Turkey and Greece and elsewhere, and there was a kind of a increase in confidence and assertiveness by communists in the United States, people got nervous. And you had the crackdown, you had McCarthyism. I mean, I don't think there's any question that when Americans are nervous about their security, they do what people generally do, which is they're willing to trade civil liberties for public safety. It's a fact. I mean, you could say it's bad, you could say it's good, but it's a fact. It's one of these natural things. It's like acquisitiveness, right? It happens, and it happens over and over again. So one way to keep our own civil liberties more secure is to try to keep the international environment from looking really threatening. And so an active policy of making the world comfortable with democracy so that we don't feel that we're being besieged or under threat is good for us. Now, that's not an argument for going off and picking fights. And in a particular case, you'd have to make a prudential judgment. Does it make sense to get involved here or there? What are our, how much is it going to cost? And what are the likely benefits? And you do your cost-benefit analysis, and you may decide we'll take a pass on that one. But, so, I mean, I'm not making a policy prescription that you could apply to any given case, but the overall point that we should not be indifferent to democracy in the world is an extremely important point, and it's a point that neocons, I think, deserve credit for having made.
Mr. Faust.
Some would say that strengthening at home would be the way to secure democracy and not worrying about abroad as much. A lot of people would say that one of the reasons, a lot of our threats to our civil liberties are coming from not being strong at home and trying to push democracy abroad. For instance, people would say that the people who participated in 9/11 said that it was because we were trying to spread our ideology into the Middle East through democracy.
Who said this?
Excuse me?
Who said that last thing?
Taliban, those who, Al-Qaeda, those who participated in...
I mean, they're saying that they justified their attack on us on the grounds that we're...
going through Israel, saying that we support Israel, we're supporting democracy in the Middle East. And we're supporting the spread of democracy and our ideals and our beliefs into the Middle East, which doesn't line up with theirs.
Their message was a little, I would argue their message was a little different from that, but
Okay.
I mean, it has been reported that way
even,
sometimes, but I would
Okay.
dispute that.
But even looking at going into the Iraq and Afghanistan, and like you said, we went into there, we war with them, we set up a democracy, or we tried to set up a democracy, or trying to, that, like you said, that's natural that we would try to do, instead of seeing what they wanted and what they wanted for themselves. And that's cost us a lot of money and run us into debt, which is also a threat to our liberties.
Okay. The first thing I would say is the suggestion that we should not be focused abroad, we should be focused on strengthening at home, implies that there's kind of a zero-sum game. And that if you are doing things abroad, then you're doing it at the expense of things you're doing at home. I'm not sure that's the case. As I said, I think that, in fact, sometimes you can do stupid things abroad that will hurt you at home, for sure. But it is not necessarily the case that anything you do abroad comes at the expense of what you do at home. Sometimes you're improving your situation domestically by taking action against enemies abroad. And it was certainly a bad thing at home in New York City on September 11th, 2001, right? You don't want that,
Of course not.
right? So, and if you want to just sit at home and do nothing and wait for bad things to happen to you, I don't think that's a wise policy. So the idea of an active policy abroad to try, basically what was referred to as forward defense, right? I mean, that's another thing. The libertarians tend to emphasize defending the country at the borders, whereas the other conservatives have traditionally said, you don't want to defend the country at the borders. That's a bad strategy. You want forward defense. You want to try to hit the enemy before he's at your border. If your enemy is already at your border, you're in a strong disadvantage when, for the fight. And so forward defense makes a lot of sense. And forward defense doesn't just mean military action. It's various types of activities and involvements abroad that can help you abort or mitigate threats that might otherwise materialize in a very bloody fashion against you. So that's one point. And then the other point about the motivation of our enemies, it is a long-standing kind of strain of argument in American politics that anything bad that happens to the United States can somehow be justified as our fault. This goes back a long way. And clever people can always make an argument along those lines. Gene Kirkpatrick, whom I mentioned, who was a Georgetown professor, who became a really brilliant, kind of outspoken member of the Reagan administration as U.S. ambassador to the UN, gave a speech once in which he talked about the blame America first crowd. Right? And these were people that whatever bad thing was going on in the world, they would explain it as our fault. I mean, I saw, by the way, I would say a recent example of this was when President Obama gave his famous Cairo speech in June 2009. He, in Cairo, Egypt, gave a speech in which he addressed why we have problems with Iran, and completely ignoring the fact that Iran had a revolution in 1979 that put in place these extremist clerics who have denounced the West and all of its depravity and declared the United States the great Satan, and then you had under their auspices the kidnapping of the Americans at the embassy. He ignored all of that, and he said, there have been tensions in relations between the United States and Iran, and I understand that because the United States overthrew a democratically elected government in Iran in the early 1950s, which is true. We did help with the British overthrow this government. But the notion that that's why we have a problem with these people, a completely different set of people who, by the way, themselves has no sympathy with the guy that we overthrew. He was basically a leftist, and I mean, anyway, it's just, as I said, if you want to be clever, you can always come up with some explanation that we're at fault for whatever bad thing goes on in the world. I believe if you actually read the writings, and I've tried to do this in some depth, the writings of the Al-Qaeda people, you will see that they have a whole philosophical view, a theological view, that says that they are in a hostile relationship, in a conflict to the death with us, having nothing to do with our trying to sell them a bill of goods or support Israel or anything. I mean, it's much more philosophical than that, and it has to do with their concept of the unity of God, and God as a lawmaker and the only legitimate lawmaker, and the suggestion that laws can be made by people is blasphemy against the unity and sovereignty of God. I mean, it's much deeper than the suggestion that we're trying to promote democracy and therefore they hit us. They have quite an elaborate understanding of why they need to attack us, and in a word, I don't think it's our fault.
Next question, Mr. Thomas.
Sir, going back to when you just said a second ago about how promoting democracy would make us safer generally. Well, I can think of instances, per se, like even Hitler came to power through democracy. And, and especially in times of crisis, maybe now or down the road in the United States, where we too, like you said, we trade, in times of crisis, you trade your civil liberties for security. And what's to stop this? I mean, obviously it worked for Hitler, and we see where that went.
Actually, I'm extremely happy that you raised that, because with all the talk about democracy,
You just helped your grade.
with all the talk about democracy, I didn't get to make a point that really is of the essence and comes out of your very good question. Democracy is a complex, multifaceted phenomenon. It is not elections, right? Elections are part of it, but I mean, if you think about it, what is the world's most successful experiment in democracy? Arguably, the Anglo-Saxon experiment, right? The development of British democracy and then American democracy. What were the major institutions of democracy? Multiple centers of power in society, right? Think of the Magna Carta, the nobles counterbalancing the power of the king, right? Multiple power centers. Private property. Independent judiciary. Independent press. These are the institutions that are absolutely crucial to self-government, right? Some degree of separation of religion and state, so that the state is not looking into people's, into people's minds. Free speech, freedom of conscience, all that. Those are the crucial elements. If you think about it, all of those elements were in place in Britain and then later in the United States, in some cases for hundreds of years before we had elections based on universal adult suffrage, which we did not have in the United States or Britain until the 20th century. Because after all, half the population couldn't vote. And so you had in place, free speech, private property, independent judiciary, the multiple power centers, all these absolutely indispensable elements of democracy. Now, part of the problem when you talk about democracy, again, it's the problem of shorthand. You talk about democracy, for many people, when they think of democracy, they think of one thing: elections. But if one rushes to elections in a society that does not have any of the building blocks of democracy in place, or even if it only has some of the building blocks of democracy in place, it should not surprise you, and it's not enormously ironic, that the elections can produce an anti-democratic result. We actually have seen many cases of that. You cited one of the more important ones, which was Hitler winning by election. But I mean, there are a number of cases where countries that have not been organized for democracy. Democracy also involves, there are kind of moral and cultural and character-related elements of a society that are important for democracy to function. For example, the spirit of compromise. The idea that you bow to the majority. If you think about it, politics in much of the world is winner take all. It's a power struggle. The idea that you can be in power and then step down and not be ruined, let alone killed, that's a gigantic intellectual, cultural, moral achievement. And it only exists in a relatively small part of the globe until fairly recently, when it's expanded a bit. So I think that the important thing raised by your question is, when you talk about promoting democracy, you can actually set democracy back by promoting democracy in the wrong way. by rushing to elections in places where you really should be building other institutions. And then, I mean, in Algeria, they had an election some years ago where they elected, a bunch of Islamist extremists, and then the government couped, the military couped the government, and you wound up with that, absolutely horrible war in the 1990s. But that was triggered by an election that produced an anti-democratic result. Now, with the Arab Spring, we have, we're watching Egypt very uneasily as democratic processes may produce the ascendancy of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Muslim Brotherhood may, if it sticks to its traditional views, govern very anti-democratically. So, I mean, we'll have to see. Now, it's also possible that once they get real responsibility, they'll moderate. I mean, it remains to be seen. But anyway, your point is an extremely good one, and what it suggests is when you're talking about democracy promotion, it's a lot more complex than simply rushing to elections.
Doug, can you have freedom in a theocracy?
Well, I guess certain kinds of freedom. I mean, they could tell you, basically, no. You wouldn't have, in a theocratic government, you wouldn't have our idea of individual liberty, which would include the right to oppose the theocrats. Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the key things that was accomplished in the Western world, in like the 17th century forward, was the separation of religion and politics to some extent. It's not a complete separation, because politics is about how we govern ourselves, and that relates to morality, and people's sense of morality is often rooted in religion. So, I mean, there's no such thing as eliminating religion from politics, but a degree of separation that provides for freedom of conscience and the free exercise of religion is really crucial to a humane politics, because it allowed politics to be about compromise rather than about truth. If politics is about truth, people kill each other. And if you could set aside truth and focus on interests that are compromisable and make that the area of politics, and take the areas of truth and say, therefore, your private conscience, then you don't have to kill people in politics. And so it was a very healthy thing when after a series of horrible religious wars, the Western world evolved the idea of keeping religion in, largely in a private sphere. Again, I'm not suggesting an absolute separation. There's no such thing as an absolute separation. But, creating bounds and private spheres that the government can't enter, where you can have your own conscience and your own, idea of ultimate truth, was a gigantic step forward for humanity.
Next question, Cadet Mellon.
We beat the ideology of socialism with Reagan's idea of and strategy of we win, you lose. What?
I'm not sure I'd call it socialism. I think I'd call it communism.
Communism.
Right.
How do we beat Islamic extremism and that ideology? And how do we apply that through our war on terror?
Well, I just completed like a 2-year project on that very question. And literally, the day before I came here, I put the final edits in a report on that subject.
Is that report public?
It's going to be.
Would love to have a copy of it and put it up as part of the website. Is it?
Yeah, it's good. I mean, it should be publicly available shortly.
Thank you.
And I would observe that the major hole in the U.S. strategy for responding to 9/11, the war on terrorism, The major hole in our war on terrorism is the one that you just put your finger on, which is, I mean, we had a strategy that I described as having three elements. One is protect the homeland. The other was disrupt and attack terrorist networks globally. And the third was counter ideological support for terrorism. The battle of ideas, as it were, right? The first two elements of the strategy were fairly highly developed. You know, the creation of the Homeland Security Department, lots of border security measures, and the attack and disrupt terrorist networks abroad was very active. Not just Afghanistan and Iraq, but I mean in the Philippines and in Africa and elsewhere. We've done lots of things, many military, but many also law enforcement or diplomatic or economic, you know, financial attacks on terrorists and the like. So it's been a very active policy. But that third element of countering the ideological support for terrorism, the Bush administration didn't do it. The Obama administration hasn't done it. Now, the Bush administration, at least some of us believed it was important. Part of the problem was, if you ask who in the US government is responsible for that, interestingly enough, there is no agency of the US government that actually has it as its mission to counter Islamist extremism. The closest you get is the State Department has an Office of Public Diplomacy. But if you think about it, public diplomacy is different from ideological warfare. Public diplomacy is trying to develop strategically useful messages, essentially, for American officials to transmit to others. But if you're going to counter Islamist extremism, the issue is not what US officials say to the Muslim world. It's what Muslims are saying amongst themselves. And the question is, how can we play in that? And that's operational. It's not a message question. How do we amplify the voices of people saying good things, useful things, anti-extremist things? How do we get resources into their hands? How do we get security for them so that they feel confident to be able to make an argument against the extremists? How do we counter the extremists? How do we deprive them of resources? How do we embarrass them? How do we expose their hypocrisies? How do we expose their corruption? How do we expose their brutality? Right? I mean, a serious operational attempt to amplify the one set of voices and counter the other.
But how do we do it?
There are ways, but there is nobody in the US government right now responsible for that.
Could you give us a couple of examples of ways of doing it?
Well, using either a government agency or like a quasi-government agency like the National Endowment for Democracy.
NGOs.
Or encouraging NGOs. I mean, in other words, there are three possible actors here. You've got the government, you've got the non-government, and then you've got this intermediate group of private organizations that get their funding from the government, right? So depending on what you do, you may want to use any one of those three. If the government does it, there are overt means of doing things and there are covert means of doing things. But basically what you're talking about is, I mean, to give you an example, I mean, getting resources into the hands of people who want to promote useful messages, financing television shows. I mean, there have been some really remarkable television shows in Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, other places. I mean, even in Afghanistan, where I don't think television is saturated households, but there are TV shows that one can promote the production of. There's radio broadcasts. There are preachers that you could give resources to get their word around. There are scholars who have interpretations of Islam that counter the teachings of the extremists. There are opportunities to create networks so that people who feel lonely with their more enlightened views understand that they're part of an international network or movement and can give them courage thereby. And there are various measures, but these are things, as I said, you have to have somebody who's got an operational frame of mind, not somebody whose idea of work is producing a glossy brochure. I mean, what happened was after 9/11, and we were talking about, okay, what can we do on the ideological front? Now, clearly, the Pentagon had its hands full. We were doing the protect the homeland and attack and disrupt terrorist networks part of the strategy. And when we would have meetings, this was literally true, State Department officials would come in and say, we just produced this brochure. And it was a full-color, glossy brochure showing happy Muslim children playing in the United States, freely learning their religion and, and living well and freely in the United States. Fine, I mean, it's nice, good. We're proud that we properly treat Muslims in America, and it's nice, and the brochure is good. I mean, I don't know who it's going to persuade, but anyway, there it is, and it's fine as far as it goes. But that was as far as it went. And the idea that somebody was actually sitting down and doing a strategy that would have been a real counterpart to the way our military developed a strategy for going after terrorists abroad, that was never done. And interestingly enough, nobody was ever assigned the mission. And there were a number of false starts, and they talked about strategic communications and global communications and this and that, but it all fell down. And I mean, part of what my report deals with is, there are bureaucratic reasons for this. I mean, if you think about it, an ideological campaign of the type that I'm talking about actually gets you crosswise in many circumstances with your diplomacy. So if you assign to the State Department the mission of doing the ideological campaign, when the bureau responsible for that comes up against the regional bureau saying, you're screwing up our relations with Pakistan, you're screwing up our relations with Saudi Arabia, the regional bureau will almost for sure trump. And so one of the things you need to do is you need to take the responsibility outside the State Department. I mean, if you think about it, democracy promotion is done really quite well by the National Endowment for Democracy. But part of the reason it can do it well is it's not in the State Department, because the State Department has other interests and other missions that would get in the way. And anyway, it's a good subject. But I think it is important to do. It's something that Rumsfeld and I talked about a lot, and he raised it in a famous memo that got leaked to USA Today it was a memo about the long, hard slog. And it got a lot of publicity when it first got leaked. But in it, he raised the question, how do we, rather than just focusing on capturing and killing terrorists, which is an extremely difficult and expensive operation, how do we make efforts to try to prevent people from becoming our murderous enemies to begin with? And it's worth the effort, because it's relatively inexpensive compared to fighting people once they become your enemies and want to kill you.
We have time for one last question. Cadet Stewart.
Taking off on that, in light of the recent events in Egypt with the crackdown on NGOs and stuff, how much could that possibly be seen as reactionary by Salafist elements that have recently gained power in the elections, as possibly trying to counteract what you have just been saying?
I think it can be. I think you're right on. I think it can be seen as that. And that's part of the war. In other words, if you're going to do a battle of ideas, the people that you're fighting can fight back. And I think my hypothesis, I don't know the details of the case, but my hypothesis about what happened in Egypt would be exactly along the lines that you laid out.
We could keep going for hours. This is fascinating and unbelievably insightful. We can't thank you enough. Again, War and Decision is a fabulous book that all of you should really take a look at as soon as possible. the war on terror, will we continue to fight it?
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of, whose line was it? Trotsky or somebody who said, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. And so, I mean, we could decide that we're not interested in fighting these Islamist extremist enemies, but they remain interested in fighting us. And so I'm afraid that, you know, we will continue to have this problem for a while.
Doug, thanks for being here at the Citadel, and I hope you'll come back soon.
Thank you.